Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar today. I'll just let folk arrive, but while that's happening, I'm Natalie Eggleton, the CEO with FRRR, the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, and we are absolutely delighted that so many of you are joining us today. We're expecting quite a few from far and wide across Australia and different sectors, and we're really excited about sharing the findings of this study with you today. We have a team from FRRR who are going to be taking us through the survey findings today, so I'm really delighted that you'll get to hear from them and their particular insights across their portfolios of work at FRRR. And I'm also delighted that our survey partner is here today as well. So Brenda Maitland is on the line, who led the survey with us from Survey Matters. So we've got a great team lined up who are ready to take us through the findings, and we've got time for questions and answers at the end. So as you're joining, it'd be great for you to just, feel free to get in the chat and add your name and the organisation and perhaps the country that you're coming from today, and we will kick off. Looks like we've got a few rolling in. So with that, I would of course like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, on which everyone is joining from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I would particularly like to acknowledge and pay respect to the continuing care for country and stewardship of the lands and seas across our country for over 60,000 years. I am joining you from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people today, headquartered at the Bendigo FRRR offices. Second time in the office in God knows how many months post-lockdown, so it's good to be back in the building. So great to see a couple of people starting to join the chat. Thank you. So on to the session today. As I said, we've got a great team of folk taking you through the findings today. I'm going to kick us off with a bit of background on why we commissioned this study and the background to the study, and then hand through the team who are going to take you through the key findings. We do have time for question and answers, so as we go, please do use the Q&A function. Probably your questions would be great in the Q&A as opposed to the chat, so we can keep an eye on those. And we will answer them live as we can, and answer them in discussion at the end of the session as well. So just before getting into the detail, I also would like to just acknowledge the partners in this initiative and this project. It's been a fantastic collaboration through the X Factor Foundation Collective, Survey Matters, obviously, who have pulled together the survey and produced this report, SEER Data and Analytics, who we are partnering with to make the data available free, particularly targeting local not-for-profits and community groups. And we ran a webinar yesterday taking community groups through that SEER Data platform and really showing its potential. And of course, Jaw Communications, who work with FRRR on all of our communications, who have been doing a fabulous job pulling all of the materials together and helping today. I'd also like to give a shout out to James De Pasquale, who's in our team and who is our Insights and Learning Manager and has been leading this project internally at FRRR and is driving the engine for us today. So thanks, James. So for those joining who might not know FRRR, we are a national philanthropic foundation specifically focused and committed to ensuring the social and economic strength of remote, rural and regional Australia. We are a partnership model that is centred around enabling collaboration and cross-sector partnerships between government, philanthropy and community, and that includes corporates as well, where we can really leverage and connect common purposes with capital for the benefit of regional Australia. So it's a leverage model, and one that is focused on collective approaches to achieving some pretty big challenges across the vast scope of Australia and all of the challenges and opportunities that regional Australia brings. So we're, as I said, headquartered in Bendigo, but we have a team spread around different parts of Australia, and proudly all regional people, and all women bar one. Which is fantastic to be supporting women in leadership the way we do in this organisation. So to the why and the background of the Heartbeat of Rural Australia survey, through supporting over 13,000 initiatives across regional Australia since FRRR began in 2000, we have developed a particular insight into the grassroots and the hyperlocal not-for-profit organisations and community groups that really, we believe, are the lifeblood and the backbone of their towns and communities. And through that, we had been noticing the particular role and the particular impact across the economic, the social, the cultural fabric and strength of those communities and vitality of those communities. But we were also noticing that they were often not heard, were hard to reach and hard to see for organisations wanting to support them and wanting to support rural Australia, and in our view, somewhat undervalued in terms of the economic role and the social role that they play in their communities, but in the broader fabric of Australia as a nation. So we sought to understand and quantify the experiences of these organisations, and particularly with a recognition of what has been experienced over the past couple of years in terms of successive natural disasters, the COVID-19 pandemic, and a whole range of other structural challenges that have been compounded by these particular experiences of the last couple of years. So we were particularly interested in how we could really get under the bonnet of what was happening on the ground for those communities, how they were affected, how they were responding, what they need, what they're challenged by. And also we had a really strong desire to place, I guess, a greater value on the role that they were playing, and really to amplify and shine a light on those organisations and share that with the broader sector. And in this case, most of the folk online today are from philanthropy, government, corporates, the likes of community foundations and others that are really anchored around supporting regional communities. So the other part is that we really wanted to offer a data-led platform for these often unheard and hard to reach community voices, where we could actually amplify the needs, the gaps and the opportunities for how to actually strengthen regional Australia through those organisations. And so that's the partnership with SEER Data and Analytics. The qualitative data is amazing, the statistical data through the survey is amazing, and we wanted to really provide a platform that could enable that to be utilised and leveraged by local communities themselves to drive their own agenda and to really set the future for their own communities. So we do think that this is a really valuable study, and it is the first of its kind that FRRR has run, and hopefully not the last, but we certainly feel like it is filling a gap in insight and knowledge that wasn't there before. Thanks, James. So in terms of the responses to the survey, we had 638 responses with a pretty good spread across the country, and unsurprisingly, probably a concentration around the more populated states, but pleasingly a pretty good spread in terms of 49% being from rural areas and 7% being from remote areas, and then 44% from regional. So we were pretty happy with that. The really, I think, important piece here that is that we were really pleased with is that we really hit the audience we were after. We got to those very grassroots organisations which have turnover of under $50,000 a year. So they are really, doing a huge amount of work with very little actual cash, and the vast majority of them are also volunteer run, which I'll get to in a moment. So we think that that's really important. The other part that is interesting is that 61% of the respondents were board or committee members or the equivalent in community groups and not-for-profits. So they were the people who were in the governing roles and who are really leading their organisations. So we were pleased with that response. Thanks, James. So to my comment just now, over half of the respondents are entirely voluntarily run. So again, we were really interested in reaching that audience and really interested in understanding the particularities of their experiences as opposed to those that have paid staff. We wanted to hear from them as well, but we felt like this was a particularly hard to reach audience. So we were really happy with that rate, and the findings do tell us a very important story about what those organisations need. I think interestingly, a relatively low percentage of them are actually registered charities, and that's a particularly interesting condition in regional Australia, in that the not-for-profit sector is made up of organisations that play very complex and multifaceted roles in their communities. They don't necessarily always fit neatly into one charitable purpose, and they often play roles that span the economic as well as the social and cultural and environmental, which means that sometimes they don't fit into a charitable category. So I'm thinking about the likes of farmer groups or chambers of commerce or the likes. which are absolutely critical but don't fit into that charitable category, which often means that they are locked out of some of the funding opportunities that are out there for them. And importantly, 73% are incorporated associations, which tells us something of the size and the nature of these organisations, that they are quite small and quite localised. Incorporated associations tend to be registered only in their state and for a particular area in their community. And there you can see on this screen that the types of focus areas that organisations that responded are working across are quite diverse. And in many cases, organisations would be actually working on many of these at once, which is a hard part to capture in terms of the data, but that's really what the data is telling us as well. And so they do play an important economic role, advocating for new community projects, supporting community infrastructure, encouraging tourism to their region, and providing links to the likes of government agencies. And so the economic role is actually somewhat undervalued. We believe that the contribution to the actual financial well-being of a community in terms of the assets and the new money that these organisations bring into communities is really quite profound and quite significant. They also play a role in creating employment opportunities and employing people at that very local level, which is quite challenging. The further away you get, the further away you tend to have to go sometimes for work. So having local opportunities is really powerful. So the top 5 economic roles that came through in the survey were advocating for new community projects, which is about trying to get new investment and new money into communities. The employment opportunities was second. Support for local businesses, training and capacity building for small business owners, which is not something to underestimate in terms of the ability to strengthen the business community for the benefit of the broader community. Encouraging tourism and enterprise development and innovation was within the top 5 as well. So they're really quite, powerful outcomes that these organisations are contributing to. The other side of it is the social and cultural role. We know that volunteerism creates and supports strong cohesion within communities, and we also know that inclusion and participation and connectedness are fundamental to community wellbeing and for communities to be strong, thriving places to live, and these organisations are absolutely the fabric of those opportunities within their communities. And so the activities that they deliver and the programs and services that they provide are very much at the intersections of all of those things. Thanks, James. So the question is, what would happen if they didn't exist? And really, in many cases, and much of the commentary that has come through the survey is that really, in many cases, the town would just possibly not survive. People would have to go elsewhere for core services. There just wouldn't be a sense of place. There wouldn't be a sense of vibrancy, and people would not have the same quality of life that they have access to now, notwithstanding the barriers to having the equality or equity in quality of life. And so we think it's pretty powerful, some of the commentary, and I hope that you'll spend time diving into the report and having a look at what some of the quotes and commentary are here, because really, one of the quotes that stuck with me is that our town would wither and die without these community groups, and I think that's true. So the call to action is, how do we actually support them and ensure that they not only survive but they thrive, and that contribution to our nation as a whole is better recognised and better supported. So all of this is in the context of a couple of years of really significant disruption and challenges, and I'm delighted to welcome our FRRR's Disaster Resilience and Recovery Lead, Nina O'Brien, to talk to you about the findings of the survey in relation to the impact of recent events. Over to you, Nina.
Thanks, Nat. And yes, as we all know, the previous 18 months truly have been unprecedented in our history. Australia really has witnessed an accumulation of negative events and natural disasters over this time, and the survey resoundingly told us that this has left remote, rural and regional community organisations feeling really exhausted and uncertain about the future, and you can see that in the word cloud there in the centre. Certainly anecdotally, it's something that we've been monitoring really closely through our conversations and our community visits, and certainly looking at that through our funding applications, and the survey findings are now a strong confirmation that this really is occurring across the board. Specifically, when we dive into the data, nearly half have had to contend with drought. 37% have faced bushfires. Significantly, 26% have experienced floods, and nearly 20% have either dealt with a moss plague or a cyclone. And so when asked to describe the current overall feeling in the community in one of the particular questions, most respondents indicated their communities were either feeling frustrated, uncertain, tired, or fatigued. Really strong words there. There was also a large number of people that told us they were feeling isolated or forgotten, and anxious about their current situation as well. However, through it all, there was a resounding thread that they've been able to band together to provide that support, compassion, and companionship to help their communities regroup and recover. But this was all before the pandemic. And then, as we know, our lives significantly changed, and barely no organisations have escaped the impact of the pandemic, with 95% of community organisations surveyed experiencing really far-reaching impacts. Many reported that COVID-19 as the last straw, given they were playing multiple roles that were core to their local community's vitality. I think while it's been long recognised that community organisations play a critical role in the community, the lack of community activity has become really highly visible during COVID, and with 52% reporting uncertainty about future restrictions, making it particularly challenging to plan ahead and host important events to raise funds. 48% of people reported that, meaning that they've lost vital income for their supporters. I think of note here too is the ripple effect that this has through small communities in particular, where community organisations often hold the annual event in the region, such as the local race meeting or a cultural festival, for instance, where often the town population doubles or more for the weekend. Events like these have not been able to fundraise for 2 years now, and this not only affects their club and their ability to pay their overheads, their ongoing running costs, they also can't distribute to others who would ordinarily benefit as a result of that fundraising. So those large events often onwards distribute their fundraising to, micro organisations like the school P&C or other small community events that leverage off that significant community event opportunity. So while grant seekers have been reporting fatigue for many months when we chat to them on the phone or in person when we're chatting to them in communities, we were interested to see the confirmation of this, with 30% of community organisations citing this. And interestingly, I think once we scratched the surface on this, it was evident that the fatigue became more pronounced with locational remoteness, with up to 45% reporting fatigue in remote locations in particular. So broadly, with fewer people and other organisations to share the load, this has led to higher rates of burnout amongst the critical working group of volunteers. We also heard a wide range of other impacts, such as forced isolations and restrictions that have meant that many people have been unable to provide their services. The cumulative effects of natural disasters have also meant fewer volunteers and increased exhaustion and frustration. The forced isolation of COVID-19 lockdowns were crippling for some communities, leaving people feeling socially and emotionally isolated. And we know this has also taken on a really unique lens in each particular location that we talk to. Often community members reported it hampered their recovery efforts, both emotionally and financially, and this has now led to an increase in mental health concerns in some communities. Many organisations also that largely provided opportunities for social interaction and education have shut their doors entirely, with not all being able to operate remotely in their location. I think, sometimes when there's a good assumption that you've got good internet, that you're able just to quickly to convert over to online delivery, and that we know that's not always the case. We've also seen the opposite side of that coin too, particularly for those providing essential services or emergency relief, where they've actually had to work twice as hard, often with fewer resources. Thanks, James. However, there is hope to this story. And while some respondents reported that there were no positive outcomes, the hugely resounding majority reported a whole range of positive things, like they're largely a resilient group of people who care deeply about each other and their communities. There is an underlying feeling of hope that things will get better. Where possible, community organisations have used the opportunities that these disasters have afforded them to find more effective ways of operating and are looking forward to a better future, which I think is really interesting. Around 30% have witnessed a greater focus on community needs and have developed new relationships within the community, which is, I think really unexpected, but really positive. I think pleasingly too that 26% have also diversified their activities and broadened their focus. In some places too, where there's been an increase in local tourism, that's actually resulted in a new business opportunity opening up or diversifying of their existing opportunities. So I think in a positive sign for the future, 20% have also reported that their community is more connected and involved, which is fantastic. So while the challenges for community organisations are not to be taken lightly, there really is hope for the future. And I'm just going to leave you with a quote from a remote community in New South Wales that really encapsulates, I think, what this overlaid impact really looks and feels like on a local level. One survey respondent told us that the drought and dust storms badly affected the economy of the town and our regional area, and local families' physical and mental well-being. The rains came, the drought broke, and then the mouse plague sought centre stage, while the Pied Piper played the wrong tune. Now with the COVID-19 pandemic is causing genuine concerns about the elderly in residential care who need voluntary services to stimulate and maintain their social and intellectual abilities. And so with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Ali Mudford, who is the lead for the people portfolio, to actually talk about some of those challenges and opportunities for community organisational workforce and volunteers.
Thank you so much, Nina. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm going to be talking about the volunteer impact and on our workforce as well. So not surprisingly, and I'm sure that this data supports a lot of what we're all seeing in our work through our outreach and our partnerships and our community conversations and in our grant making. But there's some really sobering stories coming through this research that the impact of operational restrictions, isolation orders, increased disruption, reduced revenue and increase in needs for services is having a really negative effect and impact on retaining and our staff and volunteers in the NFP sector. So overwhelmingly, 75% of organisations found it harder to attract or retain volunteers since 2020. And similarly, 70% of organisations with paid staff found it harder to attract or retain their employees. And I think there's despite that, there's still really great need for people and organisations, deep desire for people to help each other and to remain strong. But as you can see on the slide, on the charts on the right, that capacity, that reduced capacity in the volunteer sector is coming through. So, thanks, James. This can be contributed to a number of levers. So many have lost volunteers due to illness, isolation, caring for others, and a further 29% have reduced the number of volunteers due to lack of needs. So largely the inability to hold key community events. So think the local ag society running their show, think local music festivals and art exhibitions have all had a big impact on the need for volunteering in the community and who is obviously available. But this is also in contrast come at a time where 25% of the organisations saw an increase in demand for their services, and obviously that is dependent on their not-for-profit purpose and the role that they play within their community. So these organisations, they indicate they were working harder than ever in order to meet increased demand in their communities. But people with paid staff were finding it incredibly hard to attract and retain and get people to work those increased hours, and it was obviously having a negative effect. So I love that little quote from Rural Tas, which is all about people are really busy, and during the pandemic, you know, we saw some real changes in volunteer organisations. They saw a real difference in the type of people that they were volunteering and what impact it was having on their organisations. So here are some statistics around what we have heard in the research compared to the past. So more people had less time, many citing family commitments were taking up a lot of their focus during this time, unsurprisingly. Volunteers are getting older and some have exited prematurely due to the pandemic. So that's accelerated that exit. That incidental volunteering had decreased, so putting more pressure on obviously the stalwarts remaining in organisations. And I guess all of these factors, as Nina said, we repeatedly heard are leading to this deep, palpable fatigue, resulting in exhaustion and burnout. And repeatedly organisations in the survey mentioned succession and what that looked like in terms of their volunteer base, and were worried about what that looked like. So it's not all bad though. So as you can see, 38% of new volunteers were generally new to the community, or they've relocated from a larger city or town, which is a really key insight that this research is putting a spotlight on. And I guess it made me really curious as to what our sector, so what us as funders can look to support communities engage and help those new volunteers and what that welcome looks like. Thanks, James. Another really positive story that came out of the research is that organisational capacity in the bush is looking really wonderful. So look at this chart on the left. And so when organisations were asked to self-reflect on whether they were really, if they were well equipped to govern their organisation, we've got some really hard data there on those reflections. And I guess this, interestingly, necessary skills to fundraise effectively within our community is slightly lower, as is adaptation to the recent events. And I think that to me is a really positive note for community capacity of our organisations in the bush. And then on the right, we've got some data that supports operational costs or running costs of organisations. So as you can see there, over 50% of organisational operational costs are more than 75% of their revenue. And I guess it's not surprising. It doesn't, it's what we see on the ground every day, but it also, again, makes me curious in terms of what is the sector's agility able to respond to this. In times of disruption, there's a growing, as you can see, a lot of the operational costs are a big chunk of the revenue for these smaller organisations, and how can grant makers respond to that? I'm going to leave you, thanks James, on another hopeful note, which was, despite the challenges, local leaders are still really optimistic. Although there's more than half the respondents reportedly still have uncertainty, and that is of great concern, everybody is still hopeful and looking to the future. And for just over a third of respondents, they found more efficient ways of operating, have had more focus on their community and its needs, which I think, again, has been, a real asset in the bush. You've got a plan A, a plan B, a plan C and plan D. And I think this really speaks to that our communities are finding different ways and more efficient ways of doing things. So I'm going to hand over to Jill now, Jill Carina is our Place Portfolio Lead, and she's going to talk about the digital divide. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Sally. Okay, thanks, James. All right, so probably one of the most concerning things that came out of the survey was the digital divide that has emerged and been really exacerbated by COVID-19. It's highlighted the divide between our capital cities and country areas, and particularly around the unreliable nature of the internet coverage. But there's two other key contributors to the digital divide. One was around a lack of knowledge, skill, or interest in using technology, and that's particularly related to older people. And also the difficulty in funding and maintaining technology, even if they can put it in rural and remote places. The other interesting thing in this area was that even though the vast majority of groups had increased their use of digital methods over the last 18 months, there's still a huge number that rely sometimes exclusively on non-digital communication. And what that means is that even if services can be provided virtually, for many, pivoting to online delivery during COVID was not an option for them. And also it makes us think as funders that while online grant applications have increased reach and efficiency in our funding programs, they can't be the only option available to grant seekers, or we're going to miss those people on the wrong side of the digital divide. Thanks, James. So you can see from this slide that really we have a significant issue with internet connectivity across the country. So less than a third rated their internet access as extremely reliable, and in remote communities that dropped down to 20%. And then again, another third of remote respondents reported that they either had no internet access or, very unreliable access. And so what that meant is that we have seen an increase in social isolation, as often our virtual social connections are taken for granted where we have internet access, but where they're not able to be maintained, that really does isolate people. And that's probably made even worse in areas that are dealing with other natural disasters, where poor internet access has really hampered their ability to connect with people online. And so that means that they're not able to share their stories of recovery, which is always a really important aspect of recovery after a fire or other types of disasters. And then also it means that some of the recovery activities that happened online didn't reach everybody. Thanks, James. So an interesting stat that came out of the survey was that key types of technology use reduces sharply with organisation size. So what we see is that video conferencing, which is Zooms and Teams, those kinds of programs, drops from 98% for organisations with revenues more than $1 million down to 42% for organisations with less than $50,000 revenue. And more than 6 times fewer of those small organisations use YouTube and other video streaming sites or podcasts than the big organisations. And that has real implications for how we communicate with our grant seekers. To enable groups to transition to digital technology, funders really need to consider resourcing technology operating costs. Survey respondents didn't necessarily indicate that this was something that needed to happen forever, but more as a recognition that extra support was going to be required to help them bridge the digital divide during the COVID bounce back period. So that's a really key take-home message for funders, I think. You can see there that nearly half of groups either had already or plan to invest in new technology as a result of the pandemic and other recent events. And what that means is that stable internet access is going to be even more important for these groups, and that groups are going to need to focus on training and uptake by members and volunteers to make that transition effective and efficient. Thanks, James. And I just wanted to leave you with some thoughts that some of our survey respondents had put down around the way that we fund infrastructure projects, and that often we don't factor in things like increased costs for delivering projects in rural and remote areas, ongoing costs for communities such as insurance, utilities and rent, which has been really made difficult by their restricted ability to fundraise to cover costs. And also often professional project management to support volunteers is critical to making projects successful. So I just wanted to leave you with this little quote at the bottom about having to fundraise every year to cover the cost of their public liability insurance, and wonder what happens to some of those groups in years where they can't fundraise at all. So now I wanted to hand over to Sarah Matthew, who's our General Manager for our Partnerships and Services area. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Jill, and good day, everyone. So today I'll be briefly talking to you about some of the funding related elements that we saw in the survey responses and that we wanted to highlight with the sector today. So given the range of organisations who responded to the survey, as we noted earlier, and how many were small and volunteer-led, when looking at the sources of funding for organisations of different revenue sizes, it probably confirms what we might have all anticipated. The majority of small respondent organisations who have an annual turnover of less than $50,000 per year receive the majority of their funding from community events and fundraising. Or if it wasn't that, it was from membership fees. And some of the larger organisations being more reliant on government and philanthropic grants. And for me, that's another reminder of how the smaller organisations often miss out on the philanthropic and government funding. And so when you consider the cumulative layering of impacts that we've seen in the last few years, the ability for small organisations to run face-to-face events, to run their fundraising, and to seek sponsorships from local businesses who themselves are impacted is even more constrained. So now in particular seems to be a really important time for the philanthropic sector to be seeking to support these smaller organisations across our communities, and as many funders have already been doing, to increase the flexibility of the funding that is offered. If we move on to operating costs, thanks, James. So with significant reductions in revenue being experienced across many communities, many of the not-for-profits are finding it difficult to fund normal operating costs, as we mentioned earlier, especially if they didn't qualify for JobKeeper themselves. So they might be struggling to pay for operating expenses such as electricity for the community hall, insurances and ongoing maintenance costs. And in terms of those operating costs, as Ali mentioned, the average running costs across respondents came in at around 58%. The larger the organisation, the higher the cost, with more than half of respondents saying that they spent at least 75% on operating expenses and almost a third saying it was more like 100% for them. And I think that matters because it shows that for many, there's very little ability for these organisations to set anything aside or to have the ability to invest in the things that might be needed to keep the lights on and the organisation sustainable, rather than only the specific projects they're funded for. And in the context where those funding requirements have a 10% maximum cap on administration, this might not even cover the real cost of operational overheads. There's a nice quote in the report from a group in Queensland who said that some grants they just don't apply for, where the exclusions of costs of keeping the doors open actually meant that the real cost of delivering that project would eat into their savings. So it makes me consider the choices that each funder has in offering flexible funding, but also how in even the exclusions or in the definitions of administration costs, we can actually limit each group's ability to keep their lights on. And if we go to the next slide, James, I thought this respondent survey response really beautifully summarises this challenge. We saw repeatedly in the open text responses just how much groups are wanting that bit extra to give them the flexibility to not only continue to operate, but invest in themselves, their facilities, and expand their organisation's capabilities. And what this might mean for them, particularly for small organisations who don't have funds set aside or corpuses like some of the larger NGOs. And whilst the panacea might be untied funding to give not-for-profits maximum flexibility, where that's not possible, it made me wonder what it might look like if we were embedding a 10% contingency or a 10% capacity investment in addition to a 10% administration on each project budget, if that's the cap that's required, giving each organisation a greater ability to meet some of these costs, to invest in themselves or to set a little aside. And if we move on to grant flexibility, the survey also highlighted how small changes in funding arrangements can make a big difference, such as greater flexibility in how and when funding can be used by not-for-profit recipients. And whilst some respondents were happy with one-off project-based grants, many groups lament the stop-start approach that this sort of funding can have on their day-to-day, especially when there's long delays between applications and notifications. We also had reports on how quickly the costs of goods and services are changing currently, and that quotes obtained for the purposes of the submission, especially when they're hard to obtain, are no longer valid, nor are they at the same price point by the time the grant notifications are made. Overall, respondents conveyed a constant fear that funding won't be secured. Their message was that providing longer-term funding allows community organisations to plan more effectively and to use resources more efficiently. It was also commented that a longer term approach not only reduces the administration burden on the not-for-profit itself, but also perhaps for the funder too. If we move on to the next slide, James. So when we ask questions that sought to get a picture of what community groups feel about funders' approaches and understandings, the responses varied and some are pretty sobering to reflect on. Ultimately, community organisations in remote, rural and regional communities want their funding partners to get to know them and to better understand their unique situations. Only around half of our respondents agree that funders listen to and consult them about issues affecting their communities, and only 41% feel funders are open to conversations about how funds could be best used in their community. They want funders to work with them as not-for-profits so that they can better understand the funders' priorities in terms of writing their submissions, but also for funders to better understand how the funding can be used by not-for-profits and to see the positive effects that can be realised, particularly if funding is directed towards capacity building and even operational costs. We also saw in comments that suggested if funders were better able to articulate the requirements for success in their funding guidelines, that would help community organisations decide whether it's even worth the time needed to apply for the funding. And if we move to the next slide, we also asked our remote, rural and regional respondents to provide suggestions for funders. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, there were a broad range of suggestions. Aspects such as seeking out opportunities to support and understand small towns and small organisations, which is especially important in a remote, rural and regional context where the differences can be stark. There were repeated calls for simplifying grant application processes, reducing red tape, decreasing the time required to apply for grants for what are often relatively small amounts, but also in the time between application and notification, and in providing feedback on why particular applications were unsuccessful. There were also calls for ongoing flexibility in response to COVID implications in particular, and whilst recognising and appreciating the current flexibility that many funders have employed, encouraging funders to continue with this flexible approach, particularly for extensions and variations as the context requires. Some respondents also suggested having assistance available to complete applications would reduce the time and resources that they devote to seeking funding and would also free up more time for them to deliver services, especially for organisations run entirely by volunteers. Beyond the dollars, when asked what else organisations need beyond funding to improve their ability to provide their services, the most common response was that they need more volunteers. So for funders, I think we can take from this that we can be looking for opportunities to actively bolster volunteering efforts, looking to sustain volunteers and provide organisations with the ability to support the needs of volunteers as many of the volunteering demographics shift. Additionally, groups also want access to training to help run their organisations and suggest that in-kind support, such as access to experts in different fields for advice, such as grant writers, accountants, lawyers, is always extremely helpful. So with that, I'll hand back to Natalie.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, team, for taking us through all of those findings, which tell such a complex and nuanced story about what's going on across the country, in particular at that hyperlocal level. To wrap up, we've got some great questions in the Q&A, which I'll come to in a moment, but I wanted to just spend a moment just letting you know what FRRR, our early thinking is in terms of how we will respond as an organisation, as a foundation that partners with the philanthropic sector to enable funding to reach these types of organisations, and as a foundation that partners with governments and corporates to both understand those needs and get the insights, filtering back up to the policy tables, but also ensuring that the resourcing that flows is actually relevant and aligned. We feel it's important that we take a role in leading our own practice and really doing as much as we can to respond. I will say that what we heard wasn't surprising to us. It was what we had been hearing, seeing, breathing every day in our work, and so it was really validating more than anything, and it gave us a really, really good, call to action in and really good validation of the things that we had been thinking about and working on in our own practice. So, the things that we will be progressing from here is that in our own granting processes, we're doing a lot of work to simplify what is already a relatively straightforward process, but to really think hard about how we cut out the red tape and how we actually make applying for funding for these types of organisations as simple as possible and as relevant as possible. So we'll be certainly taking on board all of that and co-designing that as we go with community partners. We will be continuing to explore FRRR's role in helping to connect organisations in those communities with trusted providers around capacity building. One of the kind of call outs from the survey was about it's not all about funding. There's a need for skilled support. And what we hear is that it's actually hard for these organisations sometimes to find the right support that they need. And we think that we've got a role there that we can help to, develop a bit of a trusted network that can be called upon and deployed. We will continue to speak about this capacity building and organisational resourcing requirement. There's a lot of discussion about this at the larger not-for-profit sector level. These grassroots organisations are not often factored into that, and some of the data and the insights that the team have shared today, I think, really tell us a powerful story about why it's important to do that. So we will be continuing to do what we can to influence more and better funding of that nature. And we will also be really trying to keep on amplifying this voice and digging into the data and developing pieces that focus in on the data and the particular streams of insight so that we can really help to articulate the value and the impact that these organisations are playing. And really, I think there's a need to shift the mindset from these organisations as being project delivery groups or groups that get stuff done in communities to actually recognising it's the people that make this stuff happen, and we need to value the people as much as we do the project. So we'll be really doing a lot of thinking and a lot of practice and a lot of further digging into the data. And of course, the big piece is partnering with SEER data and analytics to make the data available. And there's been some great chat going on the side to hopefully get a lot of people along to the masterclasses, because it is a really great platform, and Christy will talk to it in the sessions, but really it's a fantastic tool in terms of linking into other open data sets and being able to align the data that's really matched up to local community need and insights as well. So that's where we're headed, and we will continue to evolve our approach as well. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and I'm hoping if they're in the chat, that'd be great if you could pop them into the Q&A so that we can see them. I'm just going to start with Julia's question to me, which was about looking into the future, say a year from now. Where do you see these important insights having the most impact in terms of influencing policy? And I'm hoping what I just described has given some insight there. From my perspective, it's partly about really using this data to get these voices into the policy making process. And from our perspective, if that's often quite hard to get into the policy making process and into decision making processes because of their hyper-localness and because of the simple breadth and depth and diversity of work that's occurring at this level. And so if nothing else, we hope that this data will actually help that perspective to be on the table during decision making when we think about digital connectivity, when we think about policy design around service systems. There's just a whole range of things that this perspective needs to be brought to the table to improve outcomes for these communities. I think the second part, as I've just said, is about the resourcing of these organisations and seeing them as more than the project delivery group or the group that kind of gets things done, and really think about the capacity. And I know there's a lot of work and a lot of emphasis at the government level around investing in leadership capacity, for example, in communities. And so, we're really heartened by what we're seeing and hearing, and I guess are here as a partner, an ally and an advocate to help that get further. So that's hopefully helpful to your question, Julia. Sarah, we had one for you, which I now cannot see. It might have been answered. Sorry.
I think it's because I answered it in the chat there, Nat, which is probably my fault. But Carolyn asked a great question, saying presumably the fact that many small organisations don't access philanthropic funding relates to their non-charitable status, which can be a big barrier. And yeah, I agree, it is a significant barrier. And my answer just is hopefully it's an area where organisations who can distribute funding to entities who aren't registered with the ACNC can assist. And I think it also points to a limitation in the sector that some of the smaller groups aren't able to take up auspicing options, which might otherwise help them with that too.
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah. And it is an important question as well. Sebastian has posted a great question, which is around what the broader options that this research surfaces might be. And I think it's great to look at it through an opportunity lens. What can we actually do smarter, better, more efficiently? And it was great to see that the findings showed that there has been a really significant increase in efficiency and operating more efficiently. And I think your suggestion there about umbrella public liability insurance, etc., is a really good one. And there are organisations, FRRR is doing some place-based work where we're seeing a really interesting pattern of what we're calling umbrella organisations, which might sort of be sector-spanning organisations at that hyperlocal level who play a really interesting role within their communities, and often they are playing that role. And Ali, I wonder if you might like to speak to some of that, because I know you're deep in this world.
Yeah, and insurance is again brought up. That's a really good point, and we hear that a lot in terms of brokering and looking at an overarching umbrella group. But I know in our work with the Investing in Rural Community Futures program, definitely the umbrella organisations are stepping up and playing that sector-wide role in supporting training, in supporting their people, and in supporting that connection. So having the one-stop shop for that community hub, that and providing that that leadership and advocacy in communities, which is so a lot of the place-based work we're doing at the moment is showing that these organisations are there and they just need support, and looking at Sarah's slides on operational funding, and just so that they can take that role up.
Fantastic, thanks Ali. There's a couple of questions there just around whether different types of data can be seen, and yes, it can be accessed on the SEER platform at a geographic level and at quite a localised level. So I do encourage you to have a look at that and get in touch with Christy and her team at SEER if you want to explore that a bit further. The questions are coming fast and furious, so I'll try and keep up. They're fantastic. Chloe, the question about the role of social enterprise to supporting community recovery is a really great one. I have my own views, and I'm a big fan of social enterprise and think that it can play a really powerful role. I think there's a question about right size, right fit, right purpose in right context, and there are lots of different ways to look at social enterprise and lots of different definitions of social enterprise, but I certainly think that locally led economic renewal approaches that integrate social engagement and participation and generational transfer of skills and development is really powerful. That can happen in a whole range of different ways, and we see it through very diverse channels, such as it might be arts as a sort of new economic driver, or it might be hospitality and tourism, for example. So there's some of the things that we think about. But Jill, I wonder if you have anything to add to that. It's a space you see a bit of.
Would agree. There's some really good examples of where community enterprise has created a heart to a community that might be struggling in a lot of different ways. It's certainly something that requires some careful thinking about not only how they're set up, but how they're supported in the longer term. So there's, often quite complex strategies that need to wrap around them in terms of how you maintain volunteer support, how you maintain funding streams, and how you link to other organisations in the community so they're not disadvantaged by new enterprises that are being set up. But it's certainly an area that I think is ripe for further exploration and tapping into to support communities that might be struggling at the moment.
Thanks, Jill. That's great. Leanne has got a question here about what ideas have been considered for ways to support revitalising the volunteer needs, especially to engage younger volunteers. I think that is a very live question for a lot of rural communities, and I think this survey provides an indication, I think, to where the opening might be, or some of the openings might be. And that's, I think, one of the positives, although not the whole country was affected by the COVID pandemic in the same way. the pressure of the pandemic has been experienced by a lot of communities in similar ways across the country. And it is requiring organisations to think very hard about what it means, what volunteering means, what's expected. The old "you become a treasurer for 20 years" is no longer actually attractive to very many people, and so the reality is that it's innovation will be born out of crisis and disruption, and we are seeing some interesting moves towards organisations and community groups thinking about how they engage young people. In our last quarter, Ali made a really great observation and did some analysis of what we've been seeing, and it was this real youth-led revitalisation. We were just seeing a huge theme, particularly in the last 6 months, around young people being put in the fore and young people really being called on. And I think it's a moment, but I also think that organisations, and it's similar to the story about new residents coming in, and tree and sea changes coming in, and it's about how you actually harness the skills in your community and how you enable transfer of leadership and how you enable transfer of innovation in your community. And there can be a bit of stuckness, there can be a bit of but we've always done it this way, and I think we're just at a moment now where having always done it this way is not going to survive. So I think that the ideas will come from the place context and the relative context of communities, and that's what we're excited about, I think, at FRRR, is being able to tap into and support those very hyper-local ideas and really back those communities to try new things and to test new ways of getting different people around the table, and innovating into what community governance and community development looks like as we move forward. But I welcome any other views on that, because I think it's an absolutely live right now discussion, and if we are going to have thriving communities and thriving community organisations, this is the stuff we need to be helping these organisations to move forward with. Ben, you've asked us what surprised. I'm going to ask any of my team if anything surprised you in the research. Just to put you on the spot. And while you're thinking, I'll say the thing, not a lot surprised me. I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of optimism that still exists despite everything. And the ability for the organisations to articulate the role that they play, I think, was really powerful as well. Any other?
As an outsider and not from FRRR, but having conducted the research, I guess the thing that really stood out for me is that digital divide, and not that thought that the community organisation itself may well have some access to internet, reliable or not, but when you get further out to the volunteers and the employees' homes, they haven't got internet or access to good and reliable and fast internet, which I think is a real shame, because if we've looked through this pandemic, the different ways that people have responded in terms of online, it's just not available to some. I got anecdotally my niece, who lives on a farm outside Edenhope in Western Victoria, she was told by NBN that if she moved to a woolshed, she could get NBN. And that just seems to be, quite a typical response, which is it's all too hard.
Just building on that, Brenda, and I guess it probably shouldn't have been a surprise, but it was really shocking to see that, the huge difference in the use of things like video conferencing for really small groups, where you've got less than half of them can access, where you've got nearly 100% of large organisations are using that regularly. So that has real implications for how they communicate with each other, as well as how they communicate externally. So I think that was pretty shocking for me.
I think my biggest pleasantly surprised, was that 30% of organisations cite fatigue as their biggest. I thought that would be a lot higher. So I think that has been a big surprise that it was only at 30%, just given the level of disruption that's happened over the last 18 months.
A surprise for me was the reliance on email and the high usage of email. I'd sort of assumed that community organisations would have a much broader ways to receive information, when in actual fact it's still really simple. And so that shouldn't be overlooked as a really primary and useful, simple way to communicate with them.
Excellent, thank you, team. There's a few more questions in the chat, but I'm afraid we have to call it to an end. But thank you so much for joining us today. I do hope that you found it valuable and insightful, and as always we're very happy to jump on the phone or email or Zoom or whichever platform happens to work wherever you are to keep talking. Do reach out to the SEER platform. Thanks very much to Brenda and your team for pulling together the data. It's been it's great, and we look forward to continuing to dive into it. And hopefully you've got our details. This session has been recorded, and we will be posting it in the next few days so that it's available to watch back. And of course the report is available on our website, and data also there as well. So thank you very, very much for joining us. Wonderful to have you all, and have a good day and a very safe new year.